In recent years, more and more people are noticing a subtle yet undeniable phenomenon. Those who seem most spiritually awake, most psychologically developed, are quietly vanishing from the collective spaces we once shared. They are leaving social media, stepping away from demanding careers, ending relationships that feel hollow, and choosing solitude or small circles of authenticity instead of the noise of mainstream society. Unlike rebellion or protest, this disappearance is neither loud nor dramatic. It is quiet, deliberate, and deeply rooted in an inner necessity. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and founder of analytical psychology, foresaw this pattern. He described it as a necessary withdrawal, an archetypal phase in the process of individuation, where the conscious individual must step back from the collective in order to preserve and deepen their hard-won awareness. Understanding this withdrawal sheds light not only on why spiritually awake people are disappearing, but also on what this means for the evolution of society itself. Awakening and the pain of the collective unconscious. Jung believes society is built on what he called the collective unconscious, a shared reservoir of archetypes, projections, and unacknowledged shadows. Culture, politics, institutions, and even everyday interactions are structured by these unconscious patterns. To function in society, one must participate in this unconscious game, whether by performing expected roles, adopting acceptable opinions, or ignoring uncomfortable truths. But what happens when someone awakens? When a person becomes deeply conscious, beyond intellectual understanding, into psychological and somatic awareness, the collective unconscious is no longer invisible. They begin to see through the shared illusions that others take for reality. They recognize the projections people cast onto each other. They feel the shadow dynamics fueling political arguments, social divisions, and even casual conversations. Once this level of perception is reached, returning to unconscious participation becomes not just difficult, but painful. Jung himself experienced this. As his consciousness expanded, he found ordinary social interactions increasingly unbearable. It was like being awake in a room where everyone else was sleep-talking. Conversations required him to pretend ignorance of what he clearly saw beneath the surface. Over time, this pretense became exhausting, even damaging to his psyche. Withdrawal was not arrogance but survival. The curse of consciousness. Psychological loneliness. This awakening often creates what Jung called the curse of consciousness, the paradox of being psychologically alone even while surrounded by people. The awakened person begins speaking a different language, perceiving dimensions invisible to others. Every interaction becomes a kind of translation, a draining attempt to bridge the gap between their consciousness and the collective unconscious. Over time, the cost of this translation becomes unbearable. Staying in society requires constant self-betrayal. Pretending to be asleep, dimming one's inner light, softening truths, and disguising authenticity to fit into collective expectations. The psyche eventually rebels, demanding retreat to preserve the integrity of consciousness. Shadow work and the burden of seeing. Central to Jung's psychology is the shadow, the disowned, denied, or unconscious aspects of the self. Individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires facing and integrating one's own shadow. Yet as one does this, another problem arises. The collective shadow becomes glaringly obvious. Society constantly projects its disowned darkness onto scapegoats. Political opponents, minority groups, rival nations, or ideological enemies. For someone who has integrated their own shadow, these projections feel like watching a mass psychosis. Social conflicts, wars, and media outrage appear less like moral battles and more like unconscious shadows clashing in the dark. One of Jung's students put it succinctly: before shadow integration, he had strong political opinions. Afterward, he realized his opinions were projections. Now, political debates look like two groups violently hurling their unconscious material at one another while calling it truth. For the awakened, joining these collective dramas feels impossible, like participating in a mass delusion. Persona collapse, the end of social roles. Jung also distinguished between the persona, the mask we wear to function in society, and the self, our authentic essence. Before awakening, living through persona feels natural. smiling when expected, playing professional roles, saying the right things. But once one has touched the self, persona performance feels like suffocation. Jung himself struggled with this after his confrontation with the unconscious. He could no longer pretend to be the proper Swiss psychiatrist who conformed to societal norms. He retreated to his tower at Bollingen, where he could live authentically, free from persona demands. This wasn't antisocial behavior. It was a commitment to authenticity. Modern examples abound. Professionals who have undergone deep inner transformation often describe boardrooms and workplaces as unbearable theaters of role-playing. Maintaining those roles feels like psychological death. Many quietly resign, seeking smaller, simpler lives that allow authenticity rather than success. They are not failing society. They are succeeding at being real. The energetic cost of consciousness. Another key reason awakened people disappear is the energy cost of maintaining consciousness in unconscious environments. For unconscious individuals, going along with the collective feels effortless. For the conscious, it's like swimming against a tidal wave. Every interaction requires filtering projections, maintaining boundaries, resisting energy drains, and holding one's truth amidst static and noise. Jung called this psychological labor, the invisible, exhausting work conscious people do just to exist in unconscious spaces. This often manifests as burnout, chronic fatigue, or mysterious illnesses. Jung observed that his most conscious patients develop symptoms not from personal pathology, but from the relentless effort of staying conscious in draining environments. The cure was not more therapy, but withdrawal, leaving the environments altogether. Many who step back into solitude or nature find their vitality restored within weeks. The Hermit archetype, withdrawal as necessity. Jung recognized this retreat as archetypal, the hermit phase of individuation. This phase is not about misanthropy or escape, but about psychological necessity. Solitude creates the conditions for integration, authenticity, and deeper wisdom. Without withdrawal, the pressure of the collective forces individuals back into old patterns en masse. The hermit archetype offers silence to hear one's inner voice, distance to break free of social illusions, and space for shadow integration without repression. Jung himself lived this archetype during his Bollingen years. For modern seekers, it may mean leaving careers, moving to rural areas, spending more time in nature, or simply disengaging from digital noise. Importantly, this withdrawal is not permanent. It is a stage of gestation where the psyche deepens, consolidates, and prepares for a possible return. Return with gifts, the border dwellers. Jung noted that those who disappear often re-emerge, but not into mainstream society. They return as what he called border dwellers, individuals who live on the margins, contributing from spaces where consciousness can exist without compromise. They may become artists, healers, teachers, or writers, creating in ways that nourish others, awakening but remaining invisible to the unconscious masses. One therapist Jung worked with withdrew for 2 years, then returned not to general practice but to working with a small circle of people in spiritual crisis. Her practice was quiet but transformative. Similarly, other awakened individuals create parallel structures, small conscious communities, alternative education, or local networks, where authenticity thrives. Evolution in action. Though mainstream society may perceive this disappearance as abandonment, Jung would say it is evolution in action. The pioneers of consciousness retreat first, building the architecture for future waves. Their withdrawal allows them to preserve depth, authenticity, and wisdom that cannot yet survive in the collective. When society ripens, these individuals, in the conscious pockets they've created, serve as beacons for others. Withdrawal is therefore not weakness, but strength, not failure, but necessity. It is the psyche's way of protecting and developing what the collective most desperately needs but cannot yet accept. Disappearance as love, not escape. Perhaps the most important point is that spiritually awake people do not disappear from hatred of society. They disappear from love, for truth, authenticity, consciousness, and even for humanity itself. They step away to preserve what cannot yet survive in collective spaces, so that one day they can return with gifts. As Jung might phrase it, To disappear consciously is not abandonment, but preparation. The hermit phase is not isolation, but integration. And those who feel the pull to withdraw should know, it is not antisocial, but archetypal. It is not escapism, but evolution. Conclusion. Spiritually awake people are disappearing from society because society runs on collective unconsciousness, shadow projection, and persona performance. Structures they can no longer sustain without betraying themselves. Their withdrawal is not weakness, but wisdom. They retreat into solitude not to escape responsibility, but to preserve and deepen consciousness. They enter the hermit phase of individuation, preparing for a potential return as border dwellers, guides, healers, and creators at the edges of society. What looks like disappearance is actually transformation. What seems like loss is the planting of seeds. The awake are quietly preparing what the collective is not yet ready for, but will one day need. Their disappearance is not abandonment. It is love in its deepest form.